Candace Fleming writes picture books, middle grade and young adult biographies. Among her nonfiction titles are Honeybee, The Busy Life of Apis mellifera, our Eleanor, a scrapbook look at Eleanor Roosevelt's remarkable life, which is the book we have today, Amelia Lost, The Life and Disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and The Rise and Fall of Charles Lindbergh. Her 2022 titles include Murder Among Friends, How Leopold and Loeb Tried to Commit the Perfect Crime, The Tide Pool Waits, Crash from Outer Space, Unraveling the Mystery of Flying Saucers, Alien Beings, and Roswell, and Polar Bear. Candy is the first young adult nonfiction author to win the LA Times Book Prize. She was awarded with 5 Young Adults, YALSA, Excellence in Nonfiction Awards. This award is given for 10 years, and she has won 4 silver and 1 gold in that time. She was the first writer to win a YALSA Excellence in Nonfiction Award and the Robert Seibert Medal for Nonfiction in the same year for 2 different books. Candy has won the Orbis Pictus Award, as well as a 2-time recipient of the Boston Globe Horn Book Award for Nonfiction and SCBWI's Golden Kite Award. I want to know where you keep all your awards. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Chautauqua welcome to Candace Fleming.
Yeah, ask my husband where I keep them. He's always hanging them up. I am so excited to be here today, and I'm so glad that people actually came. I was really worried because it's so beautiful, right? Also, you can tell that I've spoken in this venue before because I don't really have a huge thing that I'm going to say, but I actually put it in a binder. Because the last time I was here, a gust of wind sent my speech across over that way. So that's not going to happen today. We learn by living, says Eleanor Roosevelt, and I certainly have. I haven't been to Chautauqua for a decade, and I'm so excited to be back. Previously, I had been here for 7 seasons, 7 weeks. 2 of those weeks I came and I took writing courses. The other 5, I came back and I taught writing courses. And it was, in fact, while I was at Chautauqua that the inspiration to do a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt actually occurred. It occurred back in the Hall of Christ there. My editor was here with me and she suggested this idea and I seized on it because who doesn't love Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Who doesn't want to write a book about Eleanor Roosevelt? Who doesn't want to learn about Eleanor Roosevelt? I knew that I certainly did. Problem was I didn't really know much about her. She was a hero. I knew that. She was the wife of FDR. I knew that, but I didn't know much else. But I figured I have this master's degree in history. I'm a writer. I can do this. I went off to the FDR library and I began to do my research. I had scheduled 2 weeks, where I got to read her letters, and I got to read articles that she'd written in her own hand, and I watched recordings of her, and I listened to her speeches, and I didn't learn much about her. What I mean by that was I had a lot of information and I had a lot of facts, but I could not figure out the essence of Eleanor Roosevelt. I could not figure out that human. She was heroic, and every day that I learned more about her, I put her more and more and more on a pedestal. But I also knew that that pedestal was not the reason that people that I had talked to actually connected to her. And I also knew that writing about someone on a pedestal is not going to make for an interesting book. I am there on a Thursday afternoon. I'm leaving Friday after I've been at the Hyde Park. I've been in Hyde Park almost a week and a half. I have one more day, I think to myself. I have 8 hours left to find the essence of Eleanor, and I am frantic. I am no longer bothering to read things. I'm actually just having them copied on the Xerox machine, and I'm shipping them back to Chicago. Boxes and boxes that I figure I'm going to read when I get home. I feel a tap on my shoulder. It's the archivist. He wants me to go outside. Now wait, I'm there in January. He wants me to go outside. It happens to be FDR's birthday, and they're doing a birthday celebration in the Rose Garden. I don't want to go. I don't have time to go. Doesn't the archivist know that I have not found Eleanor's essence and I can't go home without it? He keeps tapping. He's persistent. The truth of the matter is he can't go out if I don't go out, and he really wants to go out because they're serving cake afterwards. And so I finally agree. I go out. I am not the most pleasant person. I'm very grumpy. I put on my coat, I stomp out there, and I stand through most of that ceremony like this. My foot's tapping, hurry it up. Happy birthday, Franklin. Towards the end, they invite us all to take a carnation and lay it on FDR's grave. I have no intention of doing this. I just want everybody else to lay their flowers quick and get on with it. A woman comes up to me, she's in her 80s, and she takes my arm and she says, will you help me across the ice? Well, of course, I have to do that. So I help her across the ice, I take my carnation and I lay my carnation and I walk away. And then I say to her, in a still not very pleasant tone of voice, I left my carnation for Eleanor. And she goes, I knew her. I knew Franklin too. It turns out the woman standing next to me is Margaret Logan Marquez. Her father, she'd actually grown up on the Roosevelt estate because her father had been the head gardener. So she had attended Christmas parties and birthday parties when Mrs. Sarah, Franklin's mother, threw them. She grew up on the estate, and when Franklin and Eleanor married, she became the babysitter. So she actually went to Campobello Island with the Roosevelts to babysit the children. And when Franklin and Eleanor went to the White House, Margaret came to visit. In fact, Eleanor wrote a My Day column about it. My friend Margaret came to visit today. Margaret invited me to her house, invited me to dinner, and she promised to tell me her stories. So I went to dinner with Margaret. In fact, actually, I brought dinner to Margaret's house. She told me exactly what she wanted. I brought dinner, and she brought down her box of memorabilia. And with everything that she pulled out and she handed to me, she told me a story. For example, she showed me a picture of herself and Eleanor standing together in Eleanor's backyard, and she pointed out Eleanor had the most meticulously beautiful manicured hands. And she said that every week Eleanor got a manicure, and every week she painted those nails red. Now the men in the audience, you may not grasp anything special about that, but as women, we're all going, I'm starting to know who she is. She also handed me a recipe of Eleanor's. It was for mock mincemeat. At the end of the season, Eleanor, instead of throwing away those green tomatoes that would never ripen on the vine or on her windowsill, would make something she called mock mincemeat. Eleanor was a terrible cook, so mock mincemeat was pretty awful. And it was a tradition in Hyde Park in the fall. Margaret swears that they could hear Mrs. Roosevelt driving into town, and they swear that they could hear those canned mock mincemeat in their jars clinking in the back seat, tink, 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 tink. And they knew that they were going to be gifted with another jar of the stuff, which they thanked her for every year and promptly threw away. She also handed me a telegram with a black border. Margaret was one of the 2,000 people that were invited to Eleanor's funeral. Sounds like a lot, but by this time she is First Lady of the world. And 2,000 people were invited, and Margaret went. She told me it was a gray day. It was drizzling. It had poured the night before, and so the rose garden was awash in mud, and they'd laid wooden boards down so people wouldn't get mired in the muck. And she said everyone was standing there, and everyone was dreary and sad. And suddenly, when they brought in the casket, the clouds opened, and this little stream of sunlight glinted right on the edge. And she said everyone's heart was lifted. She also is still, or had still been good friends with the family. And so she said to me, "Oh, you want stories?" Because I was beginning to see Eleanor as a human, right? She said, "You want more stories? I'll have David Roosevelt call you." And I thought, yeah, that'll happen. About 4 weeks later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, how do I remember? Because I used to call that arsenic hour. It's when my kids came home from school. And they brought their friends, and my home turned into chaos, and the dog was excited, so he'd jump around and he'd bark, and they'd turn on the television, usually some obnoxious cartoon that was on, blaring way too loud. And it is at 4 o'clock, at precisely arsenic hour, where SpongeBob SquarePants is screaming in the background. Do you know SpongeBob's theme song? It's obnoxious. Na 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 na. SpongeBob SquarePants. That's the sound, along with children screaming. The phone rings and I pick it up, and the voice on the other end says, "Is this Candace Fleming?" And I said, "It is." And he goes, "This is David Roosevelt. Margaret asked me to call." And then he pauses a moment, and I know he hears SpongeBob SquarePants. And he says, "Is this a bad time?" And I said, "No, it's always like this." And so we had a lovely conversation. He sent me back to Hyde Park with permission to go into the private file, the family file of the Roosevelts. This is something you can't get into unless somebody in the family gives you permission. And he told me to look for one specific thing. He said, "Look for one thing." He said, "It's my favorite story of my grandmother. It has to do with a letter from J. Edgar Hoover." I thought, that's really weird, but okay. I get to the file and I find this letter from J. Edgar Hoover, and I discover this amazing story that I had never heard. Eleanor, when she became First Lady of the United States, she was expected to have some Secret Service. But of course, she didn't want Secret Service because that would keep her away from the people. It would be a wall between her and the people that she truly wanted to meet. And so she made a compromise. And the FBI said, "Okay, no Secret Service, but here's what you need to do. You're going to have to carry a gun with you, and you're going to have to go out to the FBI range and learn to shoot it." And so she did. A few days later, J. Edgar Hoover writes to FDR, and his letter says, "My dear Mr. President, if there is anyone who should not shoot a gun, it is your dear wife. She cannot shoot the side of a barn." Eleanor never had to carry that gun. In fact, research is an amazing thing. I discovered where she kept it. She kept it in her underwear drawer for the rest of its life. She never carried the gun, and she never had Secret Service. I had discovered Eleanor's essence, but it hadn't come from the places that I had expected to find it. It hadn't come from the archival material. Rather, it had come from memories. And curiously, as my research progressed, everyone, it seemed, had a story about Eleanor Roosevelt. My next-door neighbor had a story. An elderly man I met at a book signing had a story. My editor had a story. I'm guessing the ladies of the Chautauqua Women's Club have stories. Over and over, I was offered these vivid, special, deeply personal memories of Eleanor and the lives that she had touched. Many of these stories had actually been passed down from generation to generation, like cherished family heirlooms. And each of them reflected Eleanor's vision of a more generous world, one that included people of every race and religion, of every social and economic class. She believed in the innate goodness of humanity, and by her example, she caused others to believe in it too. It is it any wonder that we cannot forget her. Eleanor Roosevelt cares first and always for people, one of her closest friends once explained. Her interest is human beings. Her hobby is human beings. Her preoccupation is human beings. Her every thought is for human beings. Harry Truman christened her the First Lady of the world. But I think of her as our Eleanor, a woman of power, grace, and vision who struggled as a parent, battled mood swings, and often doubted her abilities, but who nevertheless devoted herself to thinking and doing and growing, a woman who belongs to all of us. But I don't want you to take my word for it. Instead, I wanted to share some stories, some big and some small moments from Eleanor's life, stories that will show you who she really was. And perhaps, more importantly, they will remind us of who we are. As Eleanor always said, how can we know how to live in the present if we don't tell stories from our past? So, let's go back. Let's go back to a gray day in April 1933. The Great Depression grips the nation like a vice, and journalist Frank Kingdon has gone to Appalachia area of West Virginia to do a piece on coal mining. Imagine his shock when he steps into a miner's shack and he finds First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She's sitting on a stained bare mattress, holding a thin, naked baby in her arms while the mother stirs a watery soup on the stove. And the two women are sitting there and they're discussing household problems as if there is no difference between that shack and the White House. What in the world is the First Lady of the United States doing there? She's only lived in the White House about a year at this point, but already she's earned the nickname Everywhere Eleanor because she's flying all over the country. She's forever flying over the country, dropping in on coal miners, sharecroppers, prison inmates, migrant workers. She wants to see the conditions for herself, and she's learned to look closely. She notes soil erosion and the condition of forests and fields. She looks at the clothes hanging on the line. She looks at the cars parked at the curb. She looks to see if the house needs painting. She looks in pots and closets. She spends time in people's homes. She sits at their kitchen tables. She goes to work with them. I listened to the people, she later said, and everywhere I went, I asked, tell me, what do you need? What do you want? Eleanor believes that charity alone cannot solve hunger or poverty or unemployment. Only an enlightened government, she says, can bring about a just and humane society. Government has a responsibility to defend the weak. She's always saying this. She's forever saying this. So on this day, Everywhere Eleanor has come to see the living conditions of coal miners in West Virginia. The father shows her his weekly pay slip. Money's been deducted to pay for his bills at the company store, as well as his rent, his oil lamp, the oil for his mining lamp, and it's left him with less than $1 a week to support himself, his wife, and his 6 children. On their table, there sits a bowl of food scraps, the kind most people feed their dog, Eleanor says later. At noon, the kids run in, they grab a handful of the scraps, and then they run back out. As Eleanor readies to leave, 2 of the children approach her, a little boy holding a white rabbit and his older sister. The girl turns to Eleanor. He thinks we're not going to eat his rabbit, she whispers, but we are. The little boy hears her and, still clutching his pet, runs out the door and down the hill. That night, Eleanor returns to the White House and she tells her guests about these experiences that she's just had. The next morning, one of those guests sends her a check with an accompanying note that reads, "I hope this keeps the rabbit alive." It's a generous gesture, but it's hardly enough, and Eleanor wants to do more, much, much more. And so she convinces FDR to convince Congress to appropriate money to buy 12,000 acres of nearby farmland and to build homes for 200 families. And Eleanor will supervise it all. She will insist on, I know I almost laugh, of course she wants to supervise it all. Eleanor insists on indoor plumbing for those homes, as well as electricity and refrigerators. These are luxuries most rural houses did not have in the 1930s. And while this pushes the cost of construction for those houses from $1,000 to $10,000, she has a clear goal in mind. She wants a national policy of affordable housing for all Americans. And the project, of course, draws criticism. Some people complain that the government is giving away middle-class affluence, that you're giving away things to people who don't work for it or don't deserve it. Eleanor's reminder that those miners are hard workers falls on mostly deaf ears. Others claim the project is, and this is a quote, designed for permanent poverty, for if one expects to be given a living, one will never learn to earn one. And again, Eleanor reminds them that these are indeed hardworking citizens. Even some in the president's cabinet grumble. If Mrs. Roosevelt has her way, complains the Secretary of the Interior, how will we be able to tell the rich from the poor? Well, replies Eleanor, in a matter such as simple dignity and decency, we should not be able to tell the rich from the poor. And so in June of 1934, yeah, she works fast. In June of 1934, the first families move into those first houses in Arthurdale. That day changed my life forever, recalls one miner's daughter. There was our little white house set against a backdrop of green trees and green grass, and everything was nice and white and clean, and there was a bathroom, and it was ours. And the miner's son remembered, imagine waking up in hell one morning, but going to sleep in heaven at the end of the day. Ultimately, unfortunately, Arthurdale will prove too costly to maintain. Eleanor had hoped that businesses would take root in the town, but that never really happens, and so there are few jobs in the community. Arthurdale never really becomes self-sustaining, although it does continue today, and people did live there. Still, Eleanor feels proud of what she has achieved at Arthurdale. The homes she helped to build have given miners and their families dignity, a chance to raise their children in healthy conditions, and the ability to envision a better life. Decent housing is a basic human right that society is morally and politically obligated to provide for all of its citizens, she declared. And she will remember these lessons when she goes to the UN 30 years, or 20-some years in the future. Story number 2. It's the fall of 1938. And Life magazine has included a photograph of Eleanor asleep in an airplane with her mouth open, wide open, drool. It's an ugly picture, and it is intentionally ugly. Eleanor has plenty of critics. Actually, a poll taken in 1944 will show that 45% of Americans disapprove of her activities. Those critics not only attack those activities and her policy, but they make fun of her physical appearance. They portray her as weak-chinned, big-toothed, loud-mouthed, and it really does hurt her feelings. But she presents an unruffled appearance when reporters actually ask her about that photograph. Nobody looks very nice when he goes to sleep with his mouth open, she tells them, and she forces a laugh. And this has served to remind me to carry a large, heavy veil and swathe myself before I go to sleep on a plane ever again. As a seasoned politician, and make no doubt about it, Eleanor is a politician. She knows that a woman who insists on her right to self-identity, a woman with power or the appearance of power, is bound to elicit people's rage and their contempt. If I worried about mudslinging, I would have been dead long ago, she says. Instead, she offers this advice to other women with political aspirations. You cannot take anything personally. You cannot bear grudges. Women who are willing to be leaders must stand and take the slings and arrows. Every political woman needs to develop skin as tough as rhinoceros hide. That same year, 1938, Eleanor attends a meeting of the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Birmingham, Alabama. At this time, state law prohibits black and white people from sitting together in public gatherings. And so when the First Lady arrives, the auditorium has already been divided. White participants on one side, black participants on the other. Eleanor, however, wants to sit next to her very close friend, the black educator, Mary Bethune. And so she just goes over and sits down next to her. She plops on down and she starts chatting away. Mary, how's your family? Mary, are you coming for dinner tonight? The white side of the auditorium buzzes. And soon, the police arrive. Not even the First Lady of the United States can break Alabama's segregation laws. They insist that she has to leave her friend or she'll be arrested. Eleanor gets up, back straight, anger barely contained. She walks out of the auditorium. But minutes later, she returns with a folding chair she found in the hallway. She walks down the aisle, She places her chair right in the center, and she sits down. Arms across her chest, she refuses to get up. Her critics attack her. Eleanor cares not. Rhinoceros skin, right? It is her first act of civil disobedience, but it won't be her last. 20 years later, I love this. 20 years later, she will write the introduction to a pamphlet called Cracking the Color Code, which gave tips on how to stage sit-ins. Eleanor Roosevelt. FDR encourages Eleanor's outspokenness. You go right ahead and stand for whatever you feel is right, he tells her. If folks don't like it, I can always say I can't do a thing with you. It's smart politics, because this hands-off policy means her opinions serve as trial balloons for his administration. If some idea I expressed strongly and with which Franklin might agree caused a violent public reaction, I could honestly say he had no responsibility in the matter and the thoughts were entirely mine, explained Eleanor. If, on the other hand, the idea garners public support, Franklin will often endorse it. What are some of her most strongly held opinions? On racism. One of the main destroyers of freedom is our attitude toward the black race. We must face this problem and change our actions, or democracy will fade. On education. Wherever the standard of education is low, the standard of living is low. The government must take the lead in providing all Americans with a sound and basic education. On jobs for women. A woman can do any job a man can do, and she deserves to be paid equally for doing it. On democracy, the function of democratic living is not to lower standards, but to raise those that have been too low. And on welfare, how can a few dollars a month given to needy Americans for food, shelter, and clothing be the wrong choice for a moral nation? Story number 4. In August of 1943, Eleanor undertakes a goodwill trip to the Pacific. We are, of course, in the throes of World War II. In those 5 weeks, she travels to 17 islands, including New Zealand and Australia, and she visits an astronomical, this blows my mind, 400,000 soldiers in camps and hospitals. In her 5 weeks of going nonstop, she loses 30 pounds. And she wears out entirely 2 pairs of walking shoes. At one base, she pops into a tent completely unannounced, only to be met by the sight of 2 Marines with no pants on. Does she run? Does she shriek? No. She coolly and graciously chats away with these 2 pantless Marines, as if it's perfectly natural to see them in their skivvies. And maybe it was for her, because she did have a husband and 4 grown sons by this point. When she leaves, the 2 Marines collapse into relief and giggles. This is like my favorite story, because Marines giggling in their underwear makes me giggle too. At other times, her appearance evokes a range of responses from servicemen. Here are just a few. Holy cow, there's Eleanor. Or, howdy, Eleanor. Or, you came all this way to see me? Her compassion and her energy earn her a new nickname, Public Energy Number 1. Story number 5. It's hot and sultry on this morning in June of 1944, and Eleanor has invited the Wiltwyck School for a picnic at the Roosevelt's Hyde Park estate. Wiltwyck is a school for boys 8 to 14, boys that have been in trouble with the law, boys that have been abandoned and abused. Eleanor has sat on that board since 1942, and she will sit on the school board until her death. She will also continue to give a picnic every single year for those boys at the estate until her death. Not surprisingly, she takes a very hands-on approach to what goes on at the school. She insists that the school be inclusive. All races, all religions are all welcome, and everyone is treated equally, respectfully, and with love. One day, on this particular day, she has 100 very active boys descend on the estate, and she greets them wearing a white dress, white tennis shoes, and a very big smile. On the lawn is a huge brick grill, and Eleanor herself, with her gray hair drooping over her perspiring face, actually grills herself the hot dogs and ears of corn. She also butters hundreds of buns before roasting them on the grill. And the school staff sees her buttering, and they beg her not to do so much work. They say, the boys don't care if those buns are buttered or not. Eleanor shoots them an indignant look. When the King and Queen of England had hot dogs here, we buttered the rolls. Why should we do less for the boys of Wildwick? After lunch, one of the boys comes up to her and he asks, "Do you remember me?" "Yes," she said. "You were at the picnic last year." "That's not what I mean," he says. He clutches her hand anxiously. "Do you remember me?" Eleanor shakes her head. "I'm getting old," she explains, "and sometimes I forget names, even my best friends' names. You must forgive me." "Well, my name is John Owen," the boy says, and he runs off. Minutes later, he comes back. "Do you remember my name?" "Of course," she says, "you are John Owen." He nods, and he dashes away. But half an hour later, he's standing in front of her again. "You still know my name?" "John Owen," says Eleanor promptly. "Okay, now you've said it 3 times. The boy grins, obviously pleased. "I guess from now on you know who I am." This encounter leaves a mark on Eleanor's heart. She can't stop thinking about it. She ponders it. There's something to be learned here, she keeps saying. She keeps saying it to her friends. But what is it? Years later, she even writes about this encounter in her book, You Learn by Living. But by this time, she has realized the deeper truth of that encounter. Everyone deserves to feel recognized as an individual, she writes. Everyone deserves to feel accepted. Everyone deserves the feeling of belonging. Story number 6. It begins with a telephone call in early December of 1945 from President Harry Truman. He asks Eleanor to the United States representative to the United Nations. Eleanor's first response is to say no. Since FDR's death 8 months earlier, she's been wrestling with the question of what comes next. She knows what she doesn't want to do. She doesn't want to run an elaborate household ever again. She doesn't want to cease being useful. And she doesn't want to feel old. But can she go to the UN? She actually doubts her abilities. She thinks that her words and her opinions don't really matter. But then she thinks about it, she debates with herself, she talks to the family, and finally she decides that there are some things she can actually bring to this meeting. They are, she says, a sincere desire to understand the problems of the world and a real goodwill towards everyone on the planet. And so, at 61, Eleanor overcomes her fears and she begins a new career as a peacemaker. "I knew as the only woman I'd better be better than anybody else," she later writes. "So I read every paper, and they were very dull sometimes, as state papers can be, and I used to almost go to sleep over them, but I did read them all. I knew that if I in any way failed, it would not be just my failure, it would be the failure of all women. There'd never be another woman on the delegation." Despite her hard work, her all-male colleagues are condescending. They call her rattle-brained Mrs. Roosevelt. Believing she isn't tough enough to stand up to the Soviet delegation, they stick her on the UN's Committee on Humanitarian, Social, and Cultural Concerns. It's also known as Committee Number 3. It was a committee of little consequence, admits her most outspoken critic and colleague, Representative Arthur Vandenberg. "We figured she couldn't do much harm there." You guessed it. Committee 3 soon becomes the hotbed of debate. the biggest conflict that's going on in those first meetings. The problem is refugees living in Europe. There are approximately 1 million men, women, and children that are living in displaced camps all across Western Europe, and most of them are from Eastern Europe and Russia, where communism now reigns. These folks do not want to go back to their homelands. Soviet delegation demands that they be returned. Eleanor thinks that's ridiculous, that they should be allowed to choose where they want to live. And the debate rages for weeks. Over and over, the Russians repeat their points in these really long-winded speeches that really add up to nothing but Soviet propaganda. And at first, Eleanor actually believes she can bring the Russians around to her point of view, that she can change their minds. Eventually, she gives up. She cannot change her mind, she decides. She can only fight their ideas. And so, she begins banging her gavel freely and shaming them into making shorter speeches. She fights their fictitious arguments with really eloquent speeches presenting facts, and her persistence pays off. When the General Assembly votes on the issue, it actually sides with Eleanor. The refugees can indeed choose their own homes. And it's a huge political triumph for the United States at this time. It's also a personal victory for Eleanor. Rattle-brained Mrs. Roosevelt now emerges as the world's foremost advocate of human rights. And says Arthur Vandenberg, "I want to take back everything I ever said about her. And believe me, it's been plenty." So impressed are her fellow delegates with her that in 1947, they unanimously elect her chairperson of the 18-nation Human Rights Commission. The first order of business, of course, is to write an international Bill of Rights defining the basic freedoms of people all around the world. These include freedom of speech and a fair trial, the right to education, and a decent standard of living. Eleanor recognizes the importance of this task when she's especially eager to put these high ideals into a language that average people can grasp. So she works relentlessly for the next 2 years to get nations with different customs, religions, and governments to agree on a set of basic rights, and it isn't easy. The first draft of the document, which is patterned on our Declaration of Independence, begins, "All men are created equal." Stop, cries some delegates. That will never do. In their country, the word men would be taken literally and only applied to men. So the committee changes the beginning to read, "All humans are created." Stop, yells the Soviet delegation. Created implies a divine creator, something they don't believe in. So it is rewritten again. Now the wording reads, "All human beings are born." And so it goes. Every comma in every language is scrutinized, debated, negotiated. But finally, at 3 a.m. on December 10th, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is overwhelmingly approved by the General Assembly of the United States. The document, written in that simple, eloquent style that Eleanor had insisted on, expresses the right of every single person on our planet. It's this momentous achievement, and the delegates know it. In this rare display of emotion and tribute, the entire assembly spontaneously rises to give her a standing ovation. Eleanor, typically, is more modest. After the document's passage, she writes in her diary simply, "Long job, finished." I want you to imagine Eleanor Roosevelt on a fall afternoon in 1952. She's been visiting friends in their New York City apartment, and now she heads to the elevator to go home. But she accidentally pushes the button for the service elevator. The doors open, and there stand 2 garbage men, their reeking containers overflowing with trash. Eleanor isn't bothered. She isn't going to waste time waiting for the regular elevator. She just steps right in. When the garbage men see her, one of them casually says, as though he just saw her the day before, "Oh, hi, Eleanor. Do you think we're going to have a war over this Suez business?" She says, "Well, the situation is a serious one, but I don't think it will develop into anything large. And then she plunges into this long, drawn-out political discussion with these two garbage men. It's noisy in the elevator. The lids of the garbage can make this hard metallic bang, 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 bang sound. And then there's Eleanor's high-pitched voice and the low resonant voices of the men, and let's not forget that it smells really bad in there. But she doesn't notice any of it. When the trash-filled elevator finally gets to the ground, she remains standing until they've finished their conversation. And only when there is nothing more to discuss does she shake all their hands and walk away. 10 years later, on a gloomy night, November 7th, 1962, sad news flashes around the world. 78-year-old Eleanor Roosevelt is dead. Tributes from the world's leaders pour in. Flags are lowered to half-mast. At the UN headquarters in New York, delegates from 110 countries stand for a 1-minute silent tribute. But I like to think it is my mother's words that would have pleased Eleanor the most. My mother is watching television, and she's rocking a 5-month-old me when Walter Cronkite bursts in to the broadcast with news. My mother can't believe it. She turns to my father. But she couldn't have died at 6:15, my mother says. We were eating dinner then, and we were happy. I've chosen these stories selfishly. They have what I call hooks and echoes. Hooks because they touch me, they tug at my heart, they stay with me. They haunt me. Echoes, because in them I hear echoes of my own life and of our current American moment. Echoing across the decades, Eleanor reminds me of the kind of leadership we all deserve. Honest, modest, concerned with policies that help individuals, not corporations, or special interest groups, or lobbyists, or the base. I'm reminded that bold, uncompromising thinking like Eleanor's can drive progress in our country, that American democracy can be reimagined. And with the power that we hold as citizens, Eleanor reminds us of this again and again. With the power we hold as citizens, it is our responsibility to show up and work uncompromisingly for the future that we believe in. That's what Eleanor's life is an example of. And I think perhaps more than ever is an example we need today. I can't tell you what these stories should mean to all of you, if they mean anything at all. I don't know if you will find hooks and echoes in them like I have. Still, I'm passing them on to you, like my own cherished heirlooms, handed down to me through my research and interviews from Margaret Marquez and David Roosevelt and my mother, Carol Groth. And maybe you'll pass them on too. You know, there's a popular cartoon that was published in newspapers across the country in honor of Eleanor's 70th birthday. The picture shows an immigrant mother and her son pointing at the Statue of Liberty from the deck of a ship. And the mother asks her son if he knows what he's looking at. "Of course I know," he replies immediately. "It's Mrs. Roosevelt." Symbol of democracy, emblem of hope. You bet. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to see if there are any questions. I hope there are. Thank you. I'll start on this side since we're not on this side. Sir.
We frequently like to rank our presidents from best to worst. Where would you rank her among all the first ladies?
Eleanor? Oh, I'd rank her number 1. Yeah. Where would you rank her? I'm not allowed to ask a follow-up question, but there you go.
That's a follow-up.
Right.
So you put her number 1.
I would put her as number 1. And I think the reason I would put her as number 1 is simply because she broke the mold. Up until this point, first ladies stayed in that sphere. So they gave tea parties and hosted the Girl Scouts and that sort of thing, but didn't do anything beyond that. And she really expanded what the office of the first, there was no office of the first lady. She expanded that role.
If you transformed it.
I'm sorry?
She transformed it, in effect.
Yes, she really did.
The way Teddy did the presidency.
She really did. Yes. Thank you. Oh, over here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful speech. I really
Thanks.
enjoyed it. I think Eleanor's greatest legacy is the work she did for creating the United Nations.
Right.
And I think you would agree with that. And that's always been an inspiration to me, very important to my psyche. And I'm very saddened because of current events, the blatant disregard of the principles on which the UN based by Russia. And I was struck by Zelensky's remark that the UN should just, if it doesn't kick Russia out, it should just dissolve itself because it's not functioning. And I wonder if you have any insights from the research you've done, how you think Eleanor Roosevelt would have reacted if she were alive today, seeing what's happened.
What's happening in Ukraine? Oh, I think we all know how she would have reacted. She had been wildly outspoken about what's not happening, particularly in the UN right now, and how that declaration that she worked so hard and was fully committed to, she believed every word in that declaration, how that declaration is really being completely ignored at this point. Yeah. And again, here she is. We're talking, about something she did fully 60 years ago, right? Maybe even 70. Oh, I hate to do the math because.
Am I next?
Oh, I've got to go to this side. I forget I have to swivel. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk and
Thank
great
you.
work. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. The focus on personality and substance is refreshing and important. I want to ask gently about the alternative, the kind of prurient crap, if I may, that gets story told. I don't care if ER was ever in a bathtub with Lorena Hickok, but the PBS First Ladies series focuses on stuff like that. What to do about that, to kind of lift discourse and learning and teaching?
I think, I didn't talk about Lorena today, and I didn't talk about the other lesbians that really formed who she was. Before she had a relationship with Lorena, she had friendships, with very close friendships. And here's interesting. Lesbian women at the time were sort of mold breakers. And so they really taught Eleanor in the 1920s how to become a political woman, how to express your opinion, how to work through the system to make changes, because they were the women that were making changes at this point. So to discuss her attachment to lesbians, I think is important to talk about in terms of her formation. I don't really need all the details of her relationship. I would agree with that, unless there was a really important something to be learned about Eleanor, how she became who she was. So if we wanted to talk about Lorena Hickok, who's the one suggested that she have hold newspaper press conferences just for women newspapers or women journalists, or Marian Dickinson, who taught her how to actually give speeches and how to work with the League of Women Voters. Those are important women that we can discuss in terms of Eleanor's development. But like you said, I don't really need to know that Eleanor's in the bathtub with someone or not, right? So I agree with that. Yeah, I got a swivel.
In the summer of 1952, between Stuyvesant High School and Alfred University, I had the pleasure of being with a group of young people who were invited by Eleanor to Valkill, which was her private estate before it was open to people. I've never forgotten that day. In your research, did you find anything where there's any seminal moment that made her become so different than women of her class? Was there a seminal thing that happened, or was it just a long-term growth? Because she was the exception that almost proves the rule. What did you find?
She was exceptional. And there goes my proof, my point. Everybody has an Eleanor story. Remember we went to Valkill and she was exceptional. I've lost my train of thought. Isn't that terrible? Why did she? I think there was a moment when I did my research. There was a moment where she decided, because she spent the early part of her adulthood trying to be the perfect wife and mother, right? She tried to fit into a mold. There were I think two moments. One of the biggest moment, a lot of people like to take it from the time that she discovered that Franklin was having an affair with her personal secretary and friend Lucy Mercer, and they'd had this affair for 4 years before Eleanor discovered it. And it hurt her deeply and sort of changed her feelings, like, I'm just going to be for my own self, my own woman. I'll be a team with Franklin. But I don't think that explains it all. Instead, in one of her books, I can't remember which one it was, she talks about going to her grandmother Hall's funeral. Eleanor is now an adult by this point, married with children, and has already learned about this affair. Her grandmother Hall had raised her as a child. After her mother, both parents died, she lived with her grandmother Hall. She went to her grandmother Hall's funeral, and she recalled standing at the edge of her grave and saying to herself, why hadn't she, Grandmother Hall, why hadn't her grandmother done more? Her grandmother could paint. Why had she not painted? Her grandmother had money. Why had she not done more for those people who did not have money? Why hadn't her grandmother done more? And she claims she walked away from that moment, determined, promising herself that she would do more. So I think that might be the moment that you see her change. And then, of course, Franklin's polio voiced her. For a long time, she was the politician while he was trying to find some way to walk and going to Georgia, to Warm Springs, and she was the one that was carrying forth the political name, keeping it out there in the circles, talking to the League of Women's Voters and other organizations. So I think those are those three things that really changed her course. For all of ours better, right? Yeah. And I want to hear about your trip to Valkill. Every detail. Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah.
I greatly appreciated your presentation.
Thank you.
And standing here, I can hear what the people over there asked, and I hope that no one asked this question. But I know she was from the Roosevelt family, who were very entitled and the 1% of the country. Where did she get the compassion? Where did she get this idea of caring about every single individual, no matter how low they were?
Yeah, where did she get that compassion? Now, the family had a long family commitment to doing good, right? Teddy Roosevelt's family, her father, Elliot, is Teddy's brother. And their father had started an orthopedic hospital in New York, and they'd started a newsboys lodge so that those homeless newsboys had a place to live. And they required the kids. Eleanor went as a 5 or 6 year old. She went to the newsboys lodge and served Thanksgiving dinner. And she later in her memoirs, her diaries, would write about how she, as a child, would come home and that she really loved that feeling of helping people. So, I mean, she really got that from an early age. I also think that because she'd always felt so afraid herself as a child, she always felt so unloved, unattractive, ignored, that I think she knew how, despite all that privilege, despite all that money, she had a very terrible childhood. And she had a lot of internal feelings that I think she was able then to reflect on other people. I know your fear. I know what fear is. I know your unhappiness. I know what it feels like that boy at Wiltwyck. I know what it feels like to not be remembered, to not be valued. And I think in a large part that was part of it. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Oh.
This will be our last one.
Thank you very much
Hey.
for the presentation. Again, I couldn't hear all the questions on this side, but in this day and age, what recommendations would you make to a first lady to be able to achieve, or at least step out in the same way that Eleanor Roosevelt did? And once you've answered that, how would you shift it for the first man?
Wow, that's a big question. I wonder if I could think about what Eleanor might tell a first lady. I know the first thing she would say is that follow what you really believe, right? And not worry so much about if you're going to make people happy, voters or people that are and donors. I think she would say, follow your heart, follow your gut, follow your convictions, and use that rhinoceros skin, right? Because you know that you're going to get a lot of grief coming back. She certainly did. So I think she would say that to all of our leaders right now, is to start thinking about what you really care about, what's really important, where are your real and true convictions, and not worry so much about elections. That said, she was a politician, right? So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Not even close, probably.
It's easy to step out and pursue your convictions, but if you are a spouse of a president, in this day and age, there may be certain restrictions.
There was certain restrictions, I think, in the 30s and the 40s, too. I can't imagine what more restrictions there would be than women who still were expected to really stay home. She used to get a lot of letters. One of my favorites was some crabby lady from Missouri that scolded her that she'd taken a tour of the White House and had soiled her white gloves. And that was disgraceful, and it was all Eleanor's fault. So I'm not real sure what more restrictions. There might be different restrictions for first ladies, but I mean, she certainly did things that no one expected. She broke a mold, though nobody expected of what first lady to do the things that she did. 45% of Americans disagreed with the things that she was doing. That's a pretty large percentage, and yet she went ahead and did them anyway. They did, like I said, they did have that whole political calculation, right? You go out, Eleanor, and you tell people how you think. And then if people respond badly, I'll say, well, my wife's just spouting her mouth off again. I can't do anything about that. So that is always, it's an interesting team play, right? Yeah. So now, I think I would say the same. I mean, for when we have that woman president and he has to be the first man, I'm waiting for that day. Yeah.
Thank you for the dialogue.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed you.